So as we touched on, there is such a thing as exercise-induced asthma. So people who only have asthma symptoms when they exercise. So it's also known as exercise-induced bronchospasm, so abbreviated EIA or EIB. So after exercise, people see a drop in their FEV1. Remember, that's the forced expiratory volume in 1 second. So these values go down after exercise. Now, why people have exercise-induced asthma, no one really knows. When you take deep breaths in, you warm your air and humidify it. And is there somehow some disturbance in the warming or the humidification of the air by the time it gets to lungs, so that their air is, not quite as warm and it's much less, it's much more dry than what it should be. So with athletes, many athletes have exercise-induced asthma, and exercise can bring on an asthma response. So they need to be sure that they have their inhalers with them. So it's interesting that the asthma attack occurs after exercise has ended. So 2 to 10 minutes following exercise, and it tends to resolve itself. However, they can have something called, a second reaction. So 3 to 4, up to 8 or 9 hours after that initial reaction. So it's not during exercise, it's more immediately following exercise and then later in the day following exercise. And it's interesting, so that there's what's called a refractory period, in that a second bout of exercise gives a lesser response, so it's not quite as intense. Cold definitely does tend to intensify asthma symptoms, and most people who have asthma really need to monitor their exercise on very cold days, because cold air tends to also be very dry, less humid. So exercise responses, again, can vary. Generally, swimming, because of the humid environment, tends to elicit less of an asthma response in people who have it or who have exercise-induced asthma. Although we had one student several years ago where swimming was the one activity that actually brought it on for her. And she did competitively swim, so it may have been related more to the intensity of exercise, but typically being in a warm, humid environment like a pool tends to not bring on asthma attacks. And also a lot of pools too, if you don't have a nice pool with green chemicals, green cleaning like we have in the West Center, could also be the chemicals that could trigger an asthma attack too. So since we have no chlorine in our pool, we have the ultraviolet cleaner. That's probably a great place for someone with asthma to exercise in the West Center. Walking tends to not, cause asthma attacks. Cycling or kayaking, and kayaking probably also with the humid environment of the water. Running tends to be a little higher intensities and durations. And so once your minute ventilation, your V sub E, reaches 50 liters per minute, and that's not really that high. So we're getting probably on the higher end of moderate exercise, starting to get into intensity. Air is taken in more through the mouth than the nose. And as we mentioned, the purpose of the nose is to humidify the air, and so we're getting less humidification of the air that we're taking in. I've seen some studies that those little breathe right strips might actually help some people, but really that is not a cure, and anybody who has asthma needs to be sure that they have a rescue inhaler with them at all times, because remember the previous slides at the beginning of the lecture said there are hospitalizations and there are deaths that occur every year. So people need to be sure that they have their rescue inhaler with them. When should people exercise? And we talked a little bit about cold weather. Very cold weather. Now, fortunately, in our area, it really doesn't get super cold. But on those very cold days where we have lows in the 20s and maybe even lows in the teens, they need to really be sure that they are avoiding exercise outdoors when it's very cold. Avoiding high pollution days. You look at the air quality index. Almost every time when they give you the weather forecast, they give you the air quality index. And So typically when the air quality is either orange or higher, red, and then the highest is purple, we will, it's recommended that people avoid exercise outdoors. So an orange quality means that people who have lung diseases should not be outside. They're really going to feel an effect. When the level is higher than that with a red quality day, that means even healthy people like us should not be outside because it can have a negative effect. Avoid busy roads and factories, so you probably don't want to do your exercise on Cherry Road or Celanese or any one of the busy roads in Rock Hill, Dave Lyle. Avoid high pollen count. Even this time of year, I've been seeing on the news that there are high ragweed count. So not necessarily the tree pollen, but high ragweed, high grass pollen. If you're in an indoor program, if you're in an old building like the Withers building versus the West Center, you may need to check for dust because dust can be a very large trigger for a lot of people. So it's very nice, like the downtown Columbia Y is this beautiful multi-level historic building, but it's maybe not the best place to go if you have asthma. And obviously, for reasons we talked about the other day, avoid exercising where there's a lot of smoking and secondhand smoke, or where people tend to congregate and smoke. They've had some real problems lately in Charlotte near one of the greenways because people can no longer smoke on the Carolinas Medical Center hospital grounds. So people are going on the greenway to smoke. Well, yes, how would you like to go walking or running by on the greenway and be hit with a big cloud of smoke? So people are complaining about that, and that's why a lot of municipalities are going to, tobacco-free parks and recreational areas because people don't want to be exposed while they're trying to do physical activity.